Great. Well, welcome everyone. It's because we have the screen shared with this great cover, I can't see everyone's face. I'm Martha McPhee, and I teach creative writing in the English department. And I am thrilled to have everyone here to celebrate Glenn Greenberg tonight. This is the second event in our new series, celebrating our own, which is an offshoot of the Great Writers, Great Reading series, which I curate. This series, Celebrating Our Own, it does what it says. It celebrates the students of our creative writing programs at Hofstra. Tonight, we're going to be talking with Glenn about his nonfiction book, John Lennon. Today's the 40th anniversary of the death of John Lennon, and it would be his 80th birthday as well. Or is that true? Today is his actual birthday?
No, he would have turned 80 on October 9th.
Oh, okay. So great. So what we're going to do is Glenn and our wonderful Julia Markus, the author of biographies and novels. Her most recent biography is Lady Byron and Her Daughters. And she's in for a couple more days, our English department, but she's just retiring, alas. I'm so sad about that, but I'm thrilled that she's here with us tonight. And she will be doing the majority of the conversation with Glenn. Glenn Greenberg, who we're celebrating, is a fiction writer. He's been in our MFA program for 6 years, and he's just finished his thesis yesterday, which was very exciting. And Julia and I were in the conversation with him as he was defending his thesis, and it went brilliantly. And he graduates now after 6 years, and we'll be really sad to see him go. All along, he's been writing and reading, writing fiction and writing for his working. So that's why it's taken so long. But I really hope the conversation talks a bit about the business of writing, because your work exhibits that. You're on the one hand creating art, and on the other hand, you're doing the thing like John Lennon for hire. And it's a really magnificent piece. So that'll be fascinating to talk about. The last thing I want to mention is that in the chat, please put in questions. And I will, after Julia and Glenn speak for a bit, I will read the questions so that Glenn can answer them. And this should run about 45 minutes to an hour. And don't hesitate to ask away. And if you feel more comfortable speaking, that's fine too, but it's a little hard to see the screen, so the chat feature is better. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Julia, who will ask Glenn questions.
Hi, it's really great to be here, Glenn, and to celebrate with you. And not only have you been in the MFA program, but one of the reasons we're happy to have you for 6 years is basically you've been working full time, and you've worked at some of the biggest companies in New York, haven't you?
I'd like to think so. Yeah, I don't want to come off, arrogant or anything like that.
I said it, you didn't.
But yeah, I've worked at, I'm proud to say that I've worked at some of the biggest, companies in the world when it comes to the fields that I've worked in, including Marvel Comics, Scholastic, Time Inc., Houghton Mifflin Harcourt. So yeah, it's been a privilege.
Oh, Houghton Mifflin, that was my first publisher.
Right.
Well, yeah, and that's why working full time, and now you're starting a new job, and while doing your thesis on a serious subject, family drama, you've written the John Lennon book, and you're now writing on Star Trek, right?
Right.
Right.
Yeah, that's my next the project that I'm following this one up with is it's a similar type of publication. It's really about the creation, the history, and the legacy of Star Trek.
Right, and I think they're going to want you for another one as well. So you're a busy man. But first of all, tonight, I mean, it's a very moving anniversary, the 40th anniversary of John Lennon's murder here in New York. And any of us who were around then remember it, as I remember it as if it were yesterday. So if you don't mind me taking the stage for a second for that memory, I had been with my boyfriend to an Elton John concert in Central Park, and Elton John said, I borrowed the piano from my friend John Lennon. That was in October. So walking back after the concert, it was a good concert, great concert. We passed the Dakota, and immediately the guards stood up as if we were, mass murderers, and we left. And then within a month or two, John was murdered there. And it struck New York like a bombshell. Everyone was in shock. And the other vivid memory I have was a week later being in a party downtown, and there was a psychiatrist there from Bellevue, where Chapman was being held. And he said they never allowed, I mean, there must have been police around, but they never allowed even a doctor to go in one at a time. There were always double protection. The outrage against him was so great. So 40 years, he would have been 80 years old, a great talent lost, and recaptured in the wonderful bookazine you've done. Glenn, how was it, not only the picture's great, but the writing is so tight. How did that happen? You want to talk about that for a minute?
Well, the writing is so tight just because we were so, limited in the scope. So I really had to be very effective in terms of the information that I had to convey. There have been so many books written about not just John Lennon, but about the Beatles. And I know this because I've got most of them. I use them for research. But in terms of just, it was the main point was to just sort of really distill the story down to its most essential components. And one of the approaches that we took with this is it's not written as a biography. It's written, each chapter is sort of like an essay, focusing on a different aspect of his life. So it's not a chronological biography, a straightforward kind of thing. We'll do a chapter about the early Beatles. We'll do a chapter about the Beatles, the drug years, the influence that drugs had. We'll do a chapter about the Yoko influence. And it's all there. All the key chronological information is there, but it's not, I don't think it's done as a straightforward biography. And having each chapter zero in on a particular theme made it a little bit different and sort of helped focus on what each chapter was supposed to be about. And so this way, I didn't feel a lot of pressure to include every single aspect of his life, because that's not what the purpose of this was about.
Well, I don't think even in biography anymore that's the purpose. The cradle to death biography has flown out the window when one is interested in main aspects. And you knew a lot about John before you started, but what do you think is the most interesting thing you learned in researching and writing about John?
That's a really good question, and it's one that I've been thinking a lot about. And I think that the thing that I came away with is just how human he was. And by human, I mean flawed. We tend to put people up on a pedestal when they're famous, when they're particularly accomplished, whether it's a politician or a celebrity. And there's no question that John was exceedingly talented. He was an incredible songwriter. He was a quick wit. He had a great personality. He was funny, but he was exceedingly human, and in that he was flawed. He was just as screwed up as the rest of us, and in many ways, he communicated that to the world. He let us know just how flawed he was and how screwed up he was up until the end. But putting his whole life together, in sort of order and having it, laying it out in front of me, I really came away with the fact that he really just was an exceedingly talented human being, as mixed up and messed up and as flawed and as wonderful as anybody else. No better, no worse. Just exceedingly talented. And that's what set him apart from, from the rest of us.
Oh, it's interesting. Of course, we differ very much on Yoko Ono, but when Yoko came into his life, and after the first years, she brought him into the primal scream. She brought him into realizing what the loss of his mother had always meant to him. And you don't think those aspects are important, that she didn't, in a sense, lead him to a bigger life than he would have had just being a rock star?
I have mixed feelings about it, because on the one hand, I can't deny everything you just said in terms of she pushed him to go in different directions. I can't say I'm a big fan of a lot of the directions that he went in. I think that she didn't do anything to him or with him that he didn't want to do. John Lennon was a very strong-willed guy, and I think that's the direction that he at least allowed himself to go in. I think that her influence on him in some ways took him into some interesting directions. I think she had a negative impact in other ways. And I think that she kind of came into his world with a sense of entitlement, and he was all for it. I mean, he encouraged it, he enabled it. That's a whole other conversation. I think creatively, he did some really good stuff with her. I think he also did some really lame stuff with her. The same could be said about Paul, McCartney, with his solo career as well. I think that both of them, both Paul and John, blazed a trail in terms of bringing their wives into the band. There's a reason why most rock stars don't do that. It's not something that I would recommend. I think that John became exceedingly self-indulgent after the Beatles, and it was egged on by Yoko. That's my personal opinion. But I do think in some ways she did save him, because he was, not in a great place before she came into his life.
Yeah. So you don't consider it self-awareness, you consider it some form of conceit?
In terms of, I think they became a little too full of themselves, both of them, which actually Paul McCartney, in a song called Too Many People, he kind of took them to task for that. And I lean more towards Paul on that count.
No. So, is there anything else you'd like to say about that book, or would you like to talk about what you're working on now? Didn't you interview all of the Star Trek people?
Oh, well, no. Well, let's stick to John Lennon.
Happy to stick to John Lennon. I certainly know more about him than I do about the Star Trek people.
I have a question about the John Lennon book, about you, because I know you're such a big fan of his, and you said even earlier that you have every book. I know you're it's hyperbolic, and that you use them all for research. So actually, I have two sort of questions here. But one is, was there anything surprising that you learned? That because you knew him so well, and so that probably, you probably went into this with a real sense of, of knowledge. So where were you surprised?
I think some of the things that surprised me, well, you know what? It's a lot of it was stuff that I had in my head in terms of facts and figures and all that. And I knew this happened, I knew that happened. In laying this out, I was able to put everything into sort of like a chronological timeline to see, okay, when he did that, he was here in his life. It's not just that he did it. Here's what was going on in his life at the time. And it sort of filled in and gave me a much fuller picture of what it was like. I feel like I'm much closer to him now. Again, in terms of the facts, the figures, stuff like that, I can't say that I came away with it with any kind of epiphanies or great knowledge that I didn't have before. But it's a much fuller picture, and I feel like almost like I lived with him for about a month and a half, and got a real sense of what it was like to be around him, and on his good days and on his bad days. So, for example, I knew that he was a mean drunk. But I also got a sense of when he was a mean drunk and what prompted him to be, to these times when he was doing this or doing that or writing this song or not writing that song.
Can you give us an example of, what song was he writing when he was a mean drunk? And what was going on in his life?
Well, there's so many instances when he was a mean drunk, but in the sense that I got a real sense of during the middle period of the Beatles, when you would think that he was sitting on top of the world. And I'm talking about during the period of, Rubber Soul, Revolver, that period where he was writing some of the best songs he's ever written. And when he was not recording or working with the Beatles, he tended to be at home in this suburban mansion that he lived in with his wife and son. And he would be up in his music room most of the time, getting stoned and watching television for hours on end because he was so depressed. And he made that exceedingly obvious to his firstborn son, Julian, that he was not ready to be a father. And he felt very trapped. He was living in the suburbs when I think he really wanted to be, living in London and just enjoying himself and having a great time with his friends and his colleagues and his contemporaries. And here he was trapped in this domestic life that I don't think he was ready for. And so I felt, during my research, I kind of felt like a fly on the wall, just watching him, just sitting there in his music room, just watching TV and doing LSD all the time for months on end.
Paul McCartney was very good to Julian, wasn't he? He sort of tried to be a father to him in a certain way.
In a certain way, yeah. In fact, there's an anecdote where Paul was just interacting with Julian and being really sort of fatherly towards Julian at one point. And John just kind of watched from afar, and he went over to Paul and said privately, "How do you do it? I just don't know how to do that. I just don't know how to do that with him." And of course, Paul went on to write "Hey Jude," which was inspired by Julian because it was at the time that John and Cynthia were getting divorced. And Paul felt terrible for Cynthia and he felt terrible for Julian. And he drove out one day to visit them. And on the way, he came up with the beginnings of Hey Jude, which was written, it was inspired by Julian. So yeah, so Paul was kind of like an uncle to Julian because John just, he didn't know how to be a father to him.
And I guess he sort of tried to make that up with his second son by Yoko, huh?
To a great extent. And that is one of the things that I did discover. Again, it might have been something that kind of got past me in all the other times that I read his last few interviews. But he admitted, literally a day before he died, he literally admitted that even with Sean, he was not a great father. He was very impatient, and he doesn't know how to interact with a child. He doesn't know how to play with a child. He can write songs about Sean, but he couldn't have like a one-on-one great fatherly, father-son relationship. Just he said, yeah, it's great that I wrote a song about him, but it would have been much better if I actually, played with him. But I don't know how to do that. And he admitted he was a very impatient parent, that he was very moody, and could be really irritable. And so even with Sean, he wasn't ideal. And Sean has admitted that too.
Yeah, what Sean remembers, yeah.
Were you, so,
Martha.
no, go ahead. I'm just curious, still curious about your interest in him. Obviously, we all love his music, and so that pulls us in. But was there something particular in you about, like, are you musical? Was there some kind of thing that pulled you into him early on?
Oh, okay. Well, I've been a Beatles fan since I was around 7 or 8, going back to like 1977. One of the first albums I ever bought was the Beatles at the Hollywood Bowl. And so I'm sure a lot of it has to do with the fact that my older brother was a huge Beatles fan. I'm sure that had quite a bit of an influence on me. But a lot of it also is, my older sister loved the Monkees. And so I was a Monkees fan when I was like from very little to about 6 or 7 years old. But once I discovered the Beatles, there was no turning back. It was the quality of the music. It was the lyrics. It was, it just hooked me. And like I said, I'm sure that my older brother's influence had something to do with it. But once I really discovered them for myself, I fell for them hook, line, and sinker. And so, for those next 2 or 3 years, from 1977, 78 on, I was waiting for them to get back together as much as anybody. And so, when John Lennon was murdered, one of the first things that came to my mind is, we're never going to get that Beatles reunion. It's never going to happen now. We've been robbed of it. So, we're talking a long time now that I've been a fan of not just the Beatles, but of their solo careers. And I spent most of my youth just soaking up every single book, every biography, every news item. I have a whole scrapbook from when I was a preteen, which has a whole bunch of Beatles related news articles, interviews with McCartney.
You were a real fanboy.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, what happened? So when you were given this assignment, I really want to hear about the business of things. But before we get to that, when you were given this assignment, you must have thought, oh, cool, I can do this with my eyes shut, and it's like my life, I love it. But I bet you there was a ton of research. And so I'd love you to speak about that. I teach a class at Hofstra in researching. One's either fiction or nonfiction. And research obviously is just essential. So what was the separation between what you actually knew and what you needed to discover?
The strength of knowing as much as I know, I was able to put that to use because in terms of knowing where to look to get the specific details. I can't say that I wouldn't brag and say that I have an encyclopedic knowledge of the Beatles, because I can't spit out facts, figures, and dates and stuff like that. But I know the broad strokes of the story. So like I mentioned earlier, I have a whole library. I have a whole section of my home library. There's a whole section devoted to the Beatles and everything related to them. So I knew where to look to do the research. I knew which books to go to. I knew, which regions of those books to look at. I knew which names to look up. I have all of the key books, the biographies. There's an encyclopedia. There's a day-to-day compilation of what they were doing each day throughout their entire careers together. There are oral histories. There is a great website called BeatlesBible.com. That's a very good resource. I didn't use the internet too much just because I have all of these incredible books that already exist. There's a book by Mark Lewison. It's the first part of a 3-volume series that he's doing based on their entire history. That was a huge help. But again, because I have this vast knowledge of the Beatles, I knew where to look. I knew what sections of these books to look in. I knew what I was looking for. So for example, I need to know the date that Love Me Do came out as a single, or All My Loving. Okay, boom. But I knew already, what their first recordings were. I knew about, the audition that they did at Decca Records in 1962 where they got rejected, But if I wanted to know the details about the audition, then I knew which book to go to.
There's just a question here in the chat, which is a great one. Did you have to interview anybody?
No. This was a case of there are so many interviews and so many pieces of primary sources that are out there already that I didn't have to do any original reporting for this. I did do a little bit of original reporting for the Star Trek book that I just have been working on, but this didn't require any original reporting. Sadly enough, most of the people that I would have interviewed are no longer with us. So, probably the person that I quoted the most was John Lennon, I would have to say that the person I quoted the most, a lot of this was John Lennon in his own words. So it was all out there, and I knew exactly where to look. I have his last interview. I have his next to last interview. I have his Rolling Stone interviews from the 70s. So
that's pretty great. I mean, well, there's another question here that I feel like I already asked, but I feel like there's more room, so I'm going to repeat this. Stacy Mandel Kaplan's question. Hi, Glenn.
Hi, Stacy.
Anything in your research that surprised you or shocked you that you did not already know? And I sort of asked that a little bit back, but I do want to press you on it. And thanks, Stacy, for helping me do that. Because
here's what I can say. Here's what I can say, and this is something that I did come away with. It's one of those things where it was sort of like foggy in my head, but doing my research here really crystallized it. One of the main heroes in the John Lennon story is Paul McCartney. And that's one of the insights that I came away with. And that in all of the times when John was either at his lowest or needed the most help, Paul was always there for him. And, Paul was no angel either. I mean, Paul has his quirks and his flaws and so forth. But point for point, whenever John needed a helping hand, Paul was there for him. And I think that doesn't get nearly as much credit as it should. I think it's something that's only seen the light of day in recent years. And even Yoko has admitted to that in the last few years, is that Paul was a really good friend to John, possibly better than John was to Paul.
So this is even beyond, after they came apart, he was still always there, as you said, for his sons and stuff. Okay, so there are a bunch of other questions here. There are a few. Your wife, let's see. Being as you are such a big Lennon fan, did you think the assignment would be somewhat easy? And was it harder to get to the center of John than you thought it would be? And can you talk about the research process that went into this writing? Okay, so the last question you already addressed, but those first two are really great.
I didn't think it was going to be easy, okay. And I'll tell you why.
It never is. But I heard you say earlier that it was like you were living with him for a month and a half. Is that all this took? Was a month and a half?
Yeah.
Oh shoot! Really?
That's how much of that's the deadline that I had on this.
Oh my God, that's fast. Wow. And you pulled this off. Wow! Congratulations. That's great.
Yeah, the thesis to write too. But let me if I can get back to New York for a minute. With all this fame and all this adulation, he loved New York City. And I think anyone coming here who's really famous like that has to love it, especially if you come from a place in London where the newspaper paparazzi are just vicious, that you can live in Manhattan and be the most famous person in the world, and no one is going to bother you on the street. Oh, they'll recognize you, but they'll give you your privacy.
With one very important exception. Huh?
What?
Well, what happened 40 years ago tonight?
Oh, the thing is, I'm getting to that, is that Yoko says, I should have protected him more.
Oh, mhm.
And I wonder if the reason for that is that the type of people who congregated at the Dakota, this is unusual in New York. This is not done. So, and especially with their money, they could have, and I think she must have thought of this, that after the fact, that they could have made sure, like the guard who jumped up when I walked by innocently to see where the piano came from that Elton John used, that she must feel that, and she might even feel that till today, that the need for having rock fans around was completely unnecessary and could have been avoided with more guarding.
But it didn't happen back. I mean, that's the thing. I mean, it just, this kind of thing didn't happen. You didn't think that something like this could happen. You know, I read somewhere, I don't know if this is something that's been confirmed, but supposedly John got into the back of the car, and he said to Yoko, you know, seeing the crowd of people that were gathered around the Dakota, he said something along the lines of, and again, this may be apocryphal, but supposedly he said, you know, if something happens to me, if ever I get killed, it's going to be one of these freaks who did it to me.
Well,
and again, I don't know if that is, you know, that might be apocryphal, but it is something that I read, and I could totally believe John saying something like that.
Well, to a lighter subject, do you know, Yoko considered them very similar to the Brownings. You know, they did that record, Come Along With Me, The Best Is Yet to Be, that the age difference was the same. John was 8 years younger than Yoko, and or 6, the same as with the Brownings, and that Yoko sort of looks like Elizabeth, and that there was that connection. Did you ever look at that album, or?
I've never seen either of them mention that. But are you talking about the song "Grow Old with Me"?
Yeah, Grow Old. Okay. Yes, that's a Browning. The Best Is Yet to Be. It's
right. It didn't come up in any of my research that he consciously was quoting Browning, but I think it's probably it would be too much of a coincidence that if he wasn't.
Oh, he was, because of Yoko. Yoko saw the
oh, okay.
I mean, she even dressed up like Elizabeth. There's a picture of her dressed up like Elizabeth Barrett by the piano. Yeah.
That didn't come. I didn't come across that in the stuff that I was focusing on.
I would imagine you wouldn't, but I just thought I'd bring it in.
So there are a bunch of questions here. Should we just look at some of them, and then I still want to get to the.
I do want to answer the first part of the question that you asked, Martha, which was, you know, when my editor Bob Durr called me and asked me if I'd be interested in doing this. Of course, I was interested. But I didn't, even from the start, I didn't think it was easy, because how do you distill somebody like John Lennon in such a, you know, in such a distilled amount of space? And I wanted to do the subject justice. And so, no, I didn't think it was going to be easy. I knew it was going to be a lot of thinking and breaking it down and really having to figure out how to treat the subject matter with justice. And so I went into it knowing it was going to be a challenge. It was a challenge, but it was one of the most creatively fulfilling challenges I've ever taken on.
Wow, that is just incredible. So I mean, how lucky this is. Okay, I have to just very quickly do away with the business question, because I know students and people that want to make a career as a writer, who want to be a poet or a, you know, like a literary nonfiction writer or a novelist, as you want to be a novelist. How do you do it? And how do we make these things work, because very rarely do we make, a living on a book of poetry or a novel. And so you have to be clever and figure it out. And to be able to do that with what you love to do, which is writing, seems to be what you've achieved here. And a double bonus is that you love John Lennon. So
Right.
Can you talk about that aspect? Like, how did they come to you? Did they know that you loved John Lennon, and what is it like? And how do you balance? I mean, obviously this is for hire, so you got to do it. You had to do it in a month and a half, so the pressures are a little different. But how do you balance? I know at the same time you were doing your thesis, so that's a real world situation. How do you accomplish all that? Many questions in that little.
Right. Well, just to sort of give a as brief an answer as I can for all of those questions. One is, the fact of the matter is, and students are going to have to, understand that this is the cold hard truth, is a lot of your opportunities are going to be based on the connections that you make, the professional connections and luck. And in the case of this particular book, I was very lucky in that it was through a professional connection. My editor, Bob Durr, was somebody that I knew from when I was working at Time Inc. Bob was the publisher of Time Magazine for Kids. And when I approached him, because I wanted to work for Time for Kids, and I approached him out of the blue and wrote to him and said, I'm working at Scholastic News, which is your direct competitor. I'd much rather be working for you guys. I'd love to, can we meet? Can we have a chat? And, sometimes you will not get a, response. Sometimes you will not be welcome. But Bob was a real open-minded person, and he invited me to his office, and we he must be the most perceptive person on the planet, because not knowing that I'm a Beatles fan, not knowing how big a Star Trek fan I am, he's called me out of the blue twice now to write a book about John Lennon and now a book about Star Trek. It's just incredible. I wish I had that kind of insight. But when he contacted me, it was based on, we knew each other. He knew that I was a writer. He knew that I was an editor. And he thought of me for this.
So basically, it's all about who you know. Make those connections. And look, people are able to make them. I mean, you have to network. You have to know.
You do, but you also have to prove yourself. I mean, Bob knew that I was good enough to work at Time Inc. because he helped me get into Time Inc.
Yeah.
And Time Inc. has certain standards. They have, look, I was there for 4.5 years. I know how tough their standards are. And working there made me a much better writer. And so I think that having that experience, Bob knew that I could, or at least Bob had faith that I could, do something like this. Talent, I would like to think, does play an important role, not just for me, but for everybody. But connections are really, really important. You have to prove yourself.
They are. They're very important, and it's awful. My father, he just doesn't hate nepotism, and I'm like, oh, come on, you could help me. I mean, I would never say that to him because I know how much he hates nepotism, but it's the way the world works. Anyway, your wife had this one other question that I think is good. She said, was it harder to get at the center of John than you thought it would be? And there are a bunch of other ones here. There are a few that I'd really love to be able to answer. And time is draining.
Okay.
That was my computer power. I got to find my charger.
I think that what this project did was reinforce and clarify and crystallize what I already knew. I knew all of this stuff already about John but what it did was it painted a more clear, detailed picture. So now I feel like I know him as a person rather than as the icon, you know?
Yeah. That's beautiful. That's great.
Yeah.
Okay, so here's Peter Skolnick.
Oh, yeah. Peter.
So, he says some of John's more evocative phrases come obviously from his observations of daily British life. Some, like "I am the walrus," from literary sources like Lewis Carroll.
Right.
But what about phrases like "I am the Eggman" or "keeps her face in a jar by the door"?
Well, "keeps in a face in the jar by the door." That was Paul. That's Eleanor Rigby. That's a Paul song.
Oh, God, you see, that's amazing. You've got this whole catalog in your head, you know.
It's scary sometimes. You know, even more, that whole line about here's another clue for you all, the walrus was Paul.
Yeah, my husband just said that over here. He's listening. He
Okay.
said, "Walrus," just before you did, a little echo there.
Okay, well, that was strictly to mess with the fans, because a lot of the time it wasn't meant to mean anything. You know, some of it was probably, you know, heavily drug influenced, and he was just writing stuff off the top of his head.
Well,
so
it sort of reminds me of surrealism in a way. You know.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely, and he'd be the first to say this stuff is surreal. It wasn't meant to mean anything.
Yeah.
But
Rocket Streich, sorry. To Peter's question, I just learned that the custard dripping from a dead dog's eye is that from a lyric?
To the best of my knowledge, John came up with that off the top of his head.
But which song? I don't
know.
know.
That's "I'm the Walrus."
Oh, okay. Oh, God, that one went over me. Had, according to John Lennon's childhood friend, Pete Limerick, came from a popular Liverpool limerick. Were there many Lennon lyrics that were borrowed, in quotes, from existing poems, songs, or lyrics?
Well,
aside from being for the benefit, which we all know was inspired by John's circus poster.
Well,
wow,
come together.
This is like we're in the weeds of John Lennon here. Wow.
Well, I don't get into this I don't get into this in my publication, but "Come Together" was it starts with "Here Come Old Flat Top," and that came right from a Chuck Berry song called "Can't Catch Me," and John actually got sued over that. So I mean, they would refer to it as "nicked." Works.
And isn't that how it worked down on?
Right, exactly. It's just that you know, with "Come Together," John was a little less cautious than I think he normally was. You know, he made fun of George when George got sued for "My Sweet Lord," and he said, "Oh, George should have known better." But John got sued for "Come Together," you know. Paul, I think.
It's interesting.
I mean, Paul took "Golden Slumbers" off of Abbey Road. I mean, you know, that was a pre-existing poem. Paul just set it to music. You know, I guess Paul's attitude is if you're going to steal from somebody that's not alive to sue you.
Well, it was William Faulkner, I believe, who said, "Good writers borrow, great writers steal."
Steal, right? Yeah.
Okay, so more questions here. This is Dan Ehrlich. Is that Ginny's brother or father? Or Ehrlich, Dan Ehrlich?
It is Ginny's brother, my brother-in-law.
Okay. Glenn, what is your favorite John Lennon song and why? Has this always been your favorite song?
Okay, well, you know what? It's funny because there's actually a small chapter in this book where I list the best Beatles songs that were written either entirely or mostly by John Lennon. And in fact, that's one of the very few cases on this book where I actually turned to somebody else for help. I turned to a friend of mine, he's also a mentor to me, named J.M. DeMattis. He actually met John a couple of times in the 70s. So I asked him to give me some input and some help on putting this list together. In terms of my favorite John Lennon songs, I would say of the Beatles, from his time in the Beatles, I would say my favorite John Lennon song is probably In My Life, which was my wedding song, just because it's such a romantic and gentle and loving song. I love Tomorrow Never Knows just because it's so out there. And in terms of his solo career, I think that I mean, everybody says Imagine, so I'm going to steer clear of that. I really like Jealous Guy, and I like Watching the Wheels.
Okay, so these questions are coming in, and we're on the other side. We have like 15 minutes left, so I'm going to...
Is Bill McGee, it's his birthday today, and I think he's among us. I wonder if he is and if he has a question.
Okay, Bill, if you have one, put one in. But I want to get to these other ones. Dina Santorelli, another student of ours who we're definitely going to be celebrating at Celebrating Our Own, because she's always got novels coming out and they're so good. Okay, so Dina says, since you write both nonfiction and fiction, is your writing process different for each, or the same?
Oh, that's a really great question.
Okay, we'll get to you, Bill.
It's different. It's different. With my fiction, I'm much more freewheeling. I'm much more willing to sort of experiment. So, for example, with the project that I was doing with my thesis, I kind of just jumped into the deep water without a plan. The way I likened it to getting into my car from New York and driving to California without a map, and that's the way I worked on my thesis. With all the other stuff that I did throughout the MFA program, which was mostly fiction, I always had an outline and I always knew exactly where I was going and the stops along the way. With my nonfiction, I'm much more rigid. I'm much more structured because I feel the stakes are much higher. With nonfiction, I feel like it has to be accurate, facts, figures, and you have to put everything in a very logical structure and so forth and so on. So yeah, it's two very different ways of working.
My video is a little glitchy, so I'll come back in a second. My image, but here's from Clive. Oh, another fabulous former writer. Oh, he's terrific. We're going to be celebrating him soon too, I know that. John's story is so epic and sprawling that it could fill multiple bookazines, so condensing had to be a chore on this project. How did you decide which stories had to be told? How did you decide which were too valuable to pass up? And be quick, because you have at least 8 more questions and we're at 7:20.
The way I decided was, does it play along? So that's what I really focused on. What I really sort of had to look at. There was the stuff that I would have loved to include and the stuff that I had to include. And what I boiled it down to is nice to know versus need to know. And I had to think about the audience for this book, which was not necessarily diehard Beatle fans. We were also trying to get casual fans or new fans. Do they really need to know this minutia, or what could be considered minutia? And if it wasn't absolutely need to know, I left it out. As long as it wasn't depriving the readers of greater understanding of the man and his work, it was okay not to include it.
And isn't that, though, what we need to do with our fiction, too? If
Yes.
it's not propelling the storyline, it's got to go. Kill your little darlings, as Faulkner also said. So that seems like a good lesson for the fiction writer.
Absolutely.
My husband chimed in and said, can he give us an example? But we're at it's 7:21, and so.
Well, I can give you a very quick example. Is some of the drama that went on when the Beatles were breaking up. I could have written 3 chapters on that alone. But what it boiled down to was John and Paul disagreed on who should be their new manager.
Right. Okay.
And John went with Alan Klein, and Paul. That was a decision that Paul could not live with. And so that's how I presented the final straw that broke up the Beatles. But I could have gone into all the drama that went on, during that last year.
Okay, here's Bob Durr. What do you think would have happened had John Lennon lived?
I think that in all likelihood, the Beatles would have reunited at some point or another, probably by the mid 80s or mid to late 80s. And I think there was every possibility that John and Yoko would have split up for good.
Oh my
No, it's actually not wishful thinking. It's based on stuff that was going on around the time of Double Fantasy. It wasn't the idyllic, happy home life that they let the world think that it was. And so based on those conditions, I think that it wouldn't have happened overnight, but I think ultimately they might have started leading separate lives. But I do think there's little doubt in my mind that the Beatles, in some way, shape, or form, would have gotten together for something.
Okay, Rocket Strange. Is that how you say it?
Streich.
I love this name, Rocket. I want to have another child just to name him Rocket. J and Y always wanted to live freely. And in 1980, nobody had yet assassinated a musician.
Right.
The interview I watched today from 1968 with John and Paul had John being asked about Kennedy and MLK's assassination. His reaction seemed to indicate that he and Paul would not in any way consider themselves to be targets as rock stars. I guess it's just just a comment, like a brief comment, because you have all these others, and and we have Bill McGee here now, and I want to get to him. It's his birthday.
Bill worked with us for so many. Hello, Bill, and happy birthday again.
Happiest birthday, Bill. But comment on Rockets.
Well, John made it very clear up until his dying day, he didn't want to be a martyr. He didn't want to be a leader. He didn't want to be seen as an icon because he knew that, the Kennedys, King, they all ended up being assassinated. And he specifically said, I don't want to be that. I don't want to die. I want to live a long, happy life. I just want to, retire to the shore and, just live out this life and look at a scrapbook of madness with Yoko, 40 years from now. He didn't see himself as a prophet, and he certainly did not want to be a martyr, and he didn't want to be a leader. That was the last thing he wanted.
Okay, so Bill, take it away. You have a question here, and it's your birthday, so I want to hear your voice. Hi, it's so great to see you, Bill.
Good to see everybody. Thanks very much. Yeah, so 40 years ago tonight, I was in a bar on Long Island getting drunk, which was fairly common in those days. And of course, that was the worst birthday I ever had when we got the news about 11 o'clock or so. My question for Glenn is, I'm fascinated that you write both fiction and nonfiction, which I do as well, and I know some other people on here do as well. And I have spent a lot of time researching both my fiction and my nonfiction, and I wondered if you could speak to the research aspect of it. Does the process vary for you when you're writing fiction or when you're writing nonfiction? When you set yourself out to start the research?
Yes, because in the case of something like this or something like Star Trek, I dive into the research. I do the research first. I try to figure out what I'm going to say, and I find the materials and the sources that are going to help me say it. With fiction, I only do the research when it comes up. In other words, I'll be writing, and it's like just to give a quick example, for my thesis, I had a character who was a reporter, and I needed him to cover a story that would have been big in the New York area in 1982. So I spent hours looking for a major story that would have affected all of New York City in 1982, and I found the blizzard of April 1982. And I did as much research as I could to give that part of my fiction a real sense of reality. And so I dropped a fictional character into the midst of this very real life event, to the extent of I have him at the opening of a diner. One of the things that I discovered is a diner in my old neighborhood opened during the blizzard. And so I incorporated that into my fiction, the fiction of my thesis. So yeah, I do research, but with my nonfiction, I would say the research is much more at the core of what I'm doing than the fiction, which is I try to make up as much as I can so I don't have to do a lot of research. But when I do the research, I try to research it as diligently as I would if it was nonfiction.
Okay, all these former wonderful students are lining up. Carl Barbeau. Hi, Glenn. Boy, do I miss having discussions like these on a weekly basis. Well, they can still happen, Kyle.
Oh.
Writing from the perspective of such a fan, were you worried about doing your subject justice?
Doing it justice?
Which of course you did.
Doing it justice, that was always my concern. What was a bigger concern was being objective. And that's something that I feel that I nailed. It was a challenge because I have opinions about John. I have opinions about his music. I have opinions about Yoko. But my objective as a seasoned journalist at this point was to put all that aside and focus on the facts and telling the story as objectively as I could. So that was the most important thing to me. But yeah, it was always in the back of my head, to do this justice.
Okay, well, that's great. Then I hear from Rocket. He was disabusing me of his name, which is making me very sad. It's actually Peru, but actually I really like that name. So there we go.
Oh.
Both are good names. Bill, we got him. David Streich.
Yep.
What was John's favorite Star Trek episode? LOL. He's kidding. He says, I don't really have any questions because your book is so great. Jennifer Romanello. Hi, Glenn. Any thoughts on Peter Jackson's upcoming feature documentary about the Beatles?
I cannot wait to see it. And I was devastated when this disease postponed its release. I will be first in line to see that movie. I cannot wait to see it.
And then Peru or Rocket says, I want to know about the minutia, LOL. Let's talk. I already know all the standard info and more. Okay, so he wants to get into the nitty gritty. Dan Ehrlich says, were the Beatles friends with the Monkees?
Yeah, they actually, they met a few times, and very quickly, when the Beatles were recording Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, Mike Nesmith was a house guest at John Lennon's home during that period.
Okay, wonderful. Well, we're at the end of those questions. Julia, any final questions for Glenn?
Oh, no, I was just thinking of Glenn's work and of John tonight of all nights, and it's great to see Bill. We have to contact afterwards. It must have been a terrible birthday when that happened, but we all remember where we were. So thank you so much, Glenn. It was really interesting.
Glenn, this was so wonderful, and all of these wonderful former students who are here, let me know your news because we want to celebrate you. I just love this series, and I love that we got to celebrate you tonight. Glenn, congratulations on John Lennon and also on your thesis and graduating.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Any final words for us?
Yeah, let's do this again when my Star Trek book comes out.
We'd love to. We'd love to. Buonanotte. Good night. Thank you.
Thank you.